I like your rainbow Jason mask.
Thank you. I'm Mary Beth McAndrews from Dread Central. This is from my friend's Pride Festival, film festival fright gown this year. You got a
Nice.
cool Jason Pride mask with
That's
every
awesome.
That's
VIP
That's so
awesome.
funny because
purchase.
I have my Chucky mask on the wall.
And then I have my creepy strangers mask that I bought thinking it was a good idea, but every time I turn off the light, I scare myself.
Yep,
So
yeah,
I
that's what I
made
did.
myself.
This Chucky mask hovers. It's like just at the proper angle where it hovers just like at the top of my chair when I like walk down and I wake up every night at 4 o'clock in the morning and like I walk downstairs and I literally will like just see this head over my and then just go back.
Yep, and my cats stare at them too, like, mother? No, that's not me. But anyway, masks aside, hi, I'm very excited to chat with you guys today.
Thank you.
I love the comic. It's really good.
Thank you.
I'm a huge fan. And so, you guys have the podcast, you wrote a book, now you have a comic book, which is crazy. What was it like writing a comic? Like, how different was it from writing a actual book versus a graphic novel kind of thing?
I would say it is easier than writing a book, the other book, and more fun. This is more fun than writing a book.
Okay.
You get to have more fun ideas in there.
Yeah, but writing the book was very rewarding by the end of it, but it's also the most difficult thing that I've ever done in my entire life. It took years to do that. And the process of writing and editing and researching everything that we were doing with the book at the same time that we were still putting out the episodes like every single week, like it was writing the book was a grueling experience.
This is pure pleasure because
So much fun.
It does combine what Marcus and I's like experience lends towards. Marcus has written a lot of prose. I have written various scripts for, like I haven't yet made a pilot, but I have sold pilots, right?
Yeah.
So like I know how to write screenplays and he knows how to write prose, and it kind of managed to fold together into a comic book because as soon as we were approached to write this comic book, we were both so enthusiastic we couldn't believe it because both of us have always wanted to write a comic book. It was a huge dream of ours, and then it was like the moment came, we're like, all right, we got our idea, this is what we're gonna do, and then both Marcus and I looked at each other and we're like, how do you write this? Like, what do you do with this? And I was like, is it like a screenplay? And he was like, it's sort of like a screenplay because and then you find out people write it all different sorts of ways. Like, and so we just kind of made a formula for ourselves that I think works and are now like in the groove.
Yeah, I mean, because some people, like, for example, like an Alan Moore script for a 22-page comic it's going to be 120 pages.
He's got a lot of
writing
ideas.
because he's got a lot of ideas, and he meticulously describes every single panel. But someone else like Garth Ennis, where it's just like line, and it's very
like Batman
simple.
goes outside, and it's like that's what John McCrae described to us, where he's like, some authors are just like that. They're like, Batman goes to here, and then you have to like just. You come up with all the bullshit. So I think that we are really like we're like in the middle.
Yeah, very much so. And it was so surprising because I'm a lifelong comic book reader. I've been reading them since I was 5. Never slowed down for a second. But I'd never actually sat down and like written a comic book before. So when we finally sat down and me and Henry, we wrote out all of the scenes and Henry takes some and I take some. And when I actually sat down to write, like I found like it was very surprising that once I started, it was like I instinctually knew how to do it. I just like instinctually knew like once we got started, like, oh, this is like, it just kind of came and I started seeing the panels, and started seeing the action, just because, I've been, reading comics every day, for, 30 years, longer than 30 years, almost 35. And so like to just have that like kind of inborn ability just from doing it. And the fact that there's no rules when it comes to comic books, and there's no rules when how, like, as far as like how you write a comic or how you work with an artist, it's all completely open. So that's also so much fun to play with.
I also would like to thank my personal Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, who speaks through me, and I did some whippets. Honestly, whippets really have got me closer to Jesus all throughout quarantine, and so I've been taking a lot of whippets, and he just kind of downloaded how to write a comic book into my mind. So
yeah.
Oh, okay. Is that where you got the idea for the comic book? Whippets from Jesus? Did he give you the idea for Soul?
No, I got the idea for my mailman. Honestly, I love my neighborhood. I love whippets. No, it kind of came from the idea came from material that came from last podcast on the left, like a couple of episodes that we loved, like specifically Michael Taylor.
Yeah.
His possession murder story and the Andreessen affair, which was a alien abduction. This woman got abducted by aliens, and then because she was very Christian, she viewed this abduction scenario through the filter of esoteric Christianity, but at the same time channeled all of this shit from like ancient Christianity, not just what she knew about Christianity. Like she basically said all of the stuff. She was like revealed that the first depiction of Jesus was as a phoenix. Like that's how they originally kind of made him, and so she saw phoenixes everywhere, and then she kind of became a person people came to speak to for like holy thoughts and bullshit. Meanwhile, she just got scooped up by aliens.
Yeah, and the Michael Taylor affair, like it wasn't necessarily the murder at the end of that story, where he's a guy that, became convinced that he was possessed by a demon, and then during his, quote unquote possession, he murdered his wife. He ripped her to shreds with his bare hands. But what we took from that story was the idea that this woman who convinced him that he was possessed by a demon, she had learned everything that she knew from like a 4-day weekend exorcism course. And it's the idea of like, how something like that small, like she gets that little bit, like she is given that amount of power, and the consequences of her meddling with something like that were dire for one person. And the idea for this book is like, what if someone has that power? How badly could it go? How big could also, the consequences eventually be? And that's kind of the idea that we're playing with.
What the fuck is a demon? What the fuck is an angel? They're all aliens. Like that is in my mind. I really do. I love that people confuse them all the time. And this idea that it would be so simple that you'd get this exorcism machine and you just like pull through a demon immediately. Meanwhile, like, oh, so you could just fish through multi dimensions and just be correct. That's not how it works. Like something's going to get screwed up in the process.
Yeah.
Cool. And so you have an Exorcist reference, and I love your hat, Henry, in this, and in like the first issue. So what were some other horror influences that you wanted to pull from, not just for the story you talked about, the true crime stuff, but also the artwork? Because the artwork is really cool, and it's gross. Like it feels dirty, and I love that. So I was just curious, both inspiration horror-wise, and also what it was like kind of working with the artist to create that grimy, nasty aesthetic.
It's definitely the works of Frank Henenlotter. Which have always been a very big part of last podcast's just vibe in general.
Like 80s and 90s like exploitation horror films like are a really big influence on us, and like grindhouse films and all of that type of stuff. Like I love the idea of these like really gritty environments that these like 70s and 80s movies live in, like movies like Basket Case or like New York Ripper is another kind of influence. Those like old like Italian gross horror films.
And people live in, I like it when you're in a gross environment and people in that world live happily within it. Like Trauma. Like, I have my Trauma diploma like right above my left shoulder, as you see. And it's this vibe too, with this idea of like the happy residents of Traumaville. I think are really fun.
Yeah. And there's also a huge John Waters influence in this too. Where you look back at movies like Desperate Living, where you also have like these characters that are happily living in these horrible places. And just the kind of characters that John Waters could, create, like these like bad taste characters. Like those were definitely he was definitely an influence. And I think John Waters, he toes the line of horror sometimes. I mean, definitely Desperate Living. There's some absolute
Serial
horror.
Mom.
And that, yeah, Serial Mom,
Yes.
multiple maniacs. Like he also, like he definitely loves the horror world a little bit more than he lets on. But he can also do Hairspray.
Yeah.
John Waters is one of my favorite human beings in history. He's wonderful and a big influence.
Cool. Yeah, he is incredible. And so, you wrote this comic. It's an amazing comic, and you talked about how much you love comics. So, what are like if someone is trying to get into the world of comic books, particularly horror comics, what would you recommend for them to read to start off?
To read.
I mean, there are a lot. Like that's the things that right now we are going through kind of like a horror comic renaissance. There's so many amazing horror comics out right now. If you're looking for something very strange and unsettling, I'd recommend Ice Cream Man. If
That's
you're
a really fucking good one.
yeah, if you're a Last Podcast on the Left fan and you're interested in conspiracy, aliens, cryptid, satanic panic, Department of Truth is fantastic. If you want suspense by the same author, you got Nice House on the Lake, which is another that's on DC Black Label. If you like superheroes, Immortal Hulk has been a fantastic. Like it took the Incredible Hulk back to what the Incredible Hulk originally was, which was a horror comic. It was always meant to be a horror comic book, and there's so many great things. Saga, like if you want to go old school, go back to Alan Moore's Swamp Thing.
Yeah.
There's fucking Lock and Key.
I also think that the horror short fiction that is not comic based is incredibly important to read to understand how to tell stories succinctly. So like Teatro Grotesco, which is what I'm in the middle of reading right now, by Thomas Ligotti. It's this wonderful hodgepodge of weird and fucked up, but it's all about how to tell a story quickly, succinctly. And Robert Matheson is also like one of those, like one of my guys. I love short fiction.
I love short fiction. It's some of my favorite. And like, I feel like my attention span is so terrible these days, as probably everyone feels, but short fiction is such a good way to consume good horror content without it feeling like you have to read a whole book. There's some really good stuff out there.
Because of Last Podcast on the Left, we love to do it, but I'm reading a book a week for the show. Like I read we read our sources. We work really, really hard throughout the week. So it's hard for me to read another full-length book on top of the one or two books I'm reading for the show.
Yeah. But as far as comic book goes, that's part of why I love comic books is because it really is like such a great escape where it isn't that like heavy reading that we have to do all the time. Like I read comic books every single day of my life. It's because it's always been such a wonderful escape. And that's actually been the great thing about writing the comic is that I was actually very worried that once we started writing comics, like, okay, so we're commodifying another thing that we love, which is, that's one of the curses of the 21st century.
So everything's a hustle.
Yeah, everything's a hustle. Everything that you love has to be commodified in some way. So I was worried because comic books has been like the one true love throughout my entire life. It's the one thing that has always made me happy, no matter what. Always been my biggest escape. And I was worried that, this was gonna ruin it. But I found like writing the comic has been so much fun. I love comics now more than I ever have in my entire life.
This has made me re-fall in love with comics too, just doing the process. And also Whippets. I really can't. I can't stress enough.
Back to Whippets.
How important it is to the process. If you're a young writer, again, Whippets. Talk to your male men. If you're male women, talk to them.
But it's so cool to read comics now because now I'll read an issue and then I'll get inspiration for our comic where I'll be reading something and I'll see like how an issue is begun or how it's ended or how they handle like a reveal for a character. And then I'll think like, oh, that's perfect. That's exactly what we need for
anything
issue
that's
2.
Not tied down. That's really important as an artist. I really do believe that. Steal whatever you can. Be like, yes, that's mine now. Oh, nice thought you had there, Gardennis. Now it's mine.
But it's like, and it's in new comics too. It's like, the floppies that I go pick up every week at Action City, like here in Greenpoint, my local comic book store. I love the place. But it's like, just those little things, like these little devices that's like, oh, that would be perfect to introduce this character. That would be perfect to end, issue 3 or issue 4. my love is expanded. It makes me so happy, so cool.
Oh, I love to hear that because I feel like, again, I have the same thing, like commodifying all of my loves, like horror movies and horror comics are now my job, and it's like it's lovely to hear that you fell in love with it, because it can be scary, but
It is.
I feel like now you have probably have an appreciation for the craft of it, and you're like, I know how hard that artist worked to like color everything in and like make the lettering. Like that's so crazy with comic books. I know you guys wrote it, but like you were probably so involved in that the process of every little meticulous detail and every frame.
I
like-
still believe we have the easy part,
We do.
right? Like even though like I think that writing is obviously, I feel, you know, there's an art to it and it is difficult, and we are getting better as we go. And I think writing is another one of those things, is that the quote unquote better you get at it, the harder it actually becomes, because you start to realize like, oh, I had the freedom of sucking before, which is, you know, I can do whatever I want. Like now that I'm supposed to kind of I'm supposed to be showing improvement at some point, and then they kind of look at you like, why haven't you improved? Why aren't you?
You're like, oh, I had to improve.
Oh, I had to
No.
improve. No. I'm constant. I say it a constant. But John McCrea, like the artists, what they do is just absolutely incredible. And you can also really see how, if you don't have an artist that doesn't line up with the content that you're doing, how it might be really difficult. With something like this, we knew one thing that last podcast, and our vibe is, at least, is very specific. And so when John McCrea came on board, we're like, thank the universe that you're here, because you can interpret this in a way that bumps it up, that makes it like you really can feel the environment, you can smell the characters.
Yeah,
And like all the little details on the wall, like Jesus loves, like all the little thing, like on the van, the Soul Plumber van, like every little detail is so cool. Like I was like scouring every frame for little details because it's so cool. Like it really does add to that vibe of like gross and kind of creepy and a little icky, but like it's just so good.
There are little ideas that we've put into the script, and then he just runs with it. He's just so good.
He's fantastic. Like I couldn't believe it when McCrea said yes, because when we were looking for an artist, like our script was flying around the DC offices, and someone there read it and said like, this script is very Ennis, you know, because Garth Ennis, I know, is a huge influence on me personally. Like Preacher is one of the biggest influences of my life, not just as a comic writer, but like Preacher is a huge influence on like Last Podcast on the Left, and like introducing dark humor to my, like Garth Ennis was the one who introduced dark, violent humor to my brain.
And it's not that we stole his vibe.
No, he's just a big,
he's a huge inspired by his vibe.
He was a huge influence, you know? But so when they said like this script is very Ennis, they said, just fucking get McCrea. Why don't you get McCrea for this? And we were so lucky that because McCrea, of course, has worked with Ennis so much throughout the years. Hitman is one of my favorite comics. Like I love Hitman so much, you know, Six Pack, El Bueno, Excelente, like those characters are so funny. Like I couldn't believe that the guy that, you know, had a hand in creating those is going to be working with us. So when he said yes, and he just, his vibe, that he picked up on the vibe when we told him like, this book needs to be gross, it needs to be it needs to be creepy, it needs to make you feel icky inside. You know, you need to feel dirty after, like you need to go wash your hands after you read
take a shower after you watch it a little bit. You're like, oh god,
and he's nailing every single thing that we get to them. And then when it's going to get cosmic at one point, and he nails that too.
Yeah, the cosmic shit he also is so good at. It's pretty damn. We're very lucky.
He's nailing everything.